This week on Straight to the Point, a hitchhiker's guide to the grand conspiracy against President Trump. What is the legal theory behind it? And can these cases stand up in the federal courts? New criminal charges against the former FBI Director James Comey. Is the former CIA Director John Brennan next? And will former President Barack Obama have to answer to allegations of a treasonous conspiracy to undermine the results of the 2016 presidential election? Your questions answered, the declassified records decoded, and why the Florida federal courts may be the battleground. So let's get straight to the point. Is the grand conspiracy case about hobbling a sitting president of the United States?
Well, timing-wise, it certainly suggests that to me. An outgoing president manufacturing intelligence information with the help of a CIA director. If that's all true, that seems directed towards fueling what became kind of frivolous impeachments from my perspective.
What is the legal theory behind the grand conspiracy, and is it viable in the federal courts?
I think there's a good chance that you're talking about a deprivation of civil rights under 18 U.S. Code 242. Ironically, perhaps, you could argue that there's a conspiracy to defraud the United States, which was a lead charge that Jack Smith used for January 6th.
Let's talk about the Florida case. This is the investigation involving the former CIA Director, John Brennan. Do you believe John Brennan gets indicted?
It certainly feels like it's heading that way. What I think about with Brennan is, and same with some other people we'll talk about, like Mr. Comey, there's an incredible amount of room for moral blame. I do think the transparency for what was happening in terms of the Obama administration and Brennan and Comey, there's a lot of people that deserve a lot of scrutiny for what they did. Whether that hangs together as a criminal prosecution is really an entirely different question, particularly when you're talking about something 9 or 10 years ago. And in conspiracy cases, there is room for that. But it's not going to be just substantively what happened in 2016 or 17 without, serious procedural questions.
You've described the Florida investigations and potential prosecutions as the mothership. What do you mean that Florida is the mothership?
Well, my impression is that whatever's coming out of Florida, if there's an indictment, is going to be the broadest indictment in terms of covering timeframes, covering people and officials, and perhaps different charges. It's going to be more about election interference conducted by people at the highest reaches of government. So that would certainly be a much more impactful, much more historic prosecution if that comes out.
If charges are brought, do you anticipate it will include this 18 U.S.C. 242, which is deprivation of rights under color of law?
Yeah, best guess is yes. There could be some sort of honest services fraud angle that they try to pursue as well. But I think that the most likely hook there is that 242.
For a layperson, what is 18 U.S.C. 242?
Well, it takes willful, intentional conduct by someone that's designed to take away constitutionally protected rights of another person. What's interesting here is you could couch that in terms of President Trump's right to kind of run unopposed or not face scurrilous impeachments, or you could view it as the voters as a victim of the conduct. A lot of the 242 cases you see involve law enforcement. These are like abusive force cases by the police where they have an obligation to, act within certain constitutional boundaries, and they go out and they do something that is beyond the pale in terms of, violence or abuse or illegal searches, things of that nature. So you have to identify the constitutional right that's at play. Maybe it's the right to a fair election. And then you have to decide, who's the victim that you're alleging in these circumstances.
So let's drill down a little further in the Brennan case. As background, in 2017, there was an intelligence assessment that created this public narrative that President Trump was a puppet of Russia. Brennan allegedly lied to Congress about the fact that this Steele dossier, which was Democrat-funded opposition research, was part of the intelligence report. Based on the criminal statutes, would that be sufficient to show an abuse of authority?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, this is a little bit new territory, but I do think it probably has that color of law component to let that happen. You've got a situation, and the willfulness is going to be important here. He insisted in putting it in. At least that's the allegation. That's a pretty important moment showing that he knows what he's doing, that he's politicized, and he's acting on those political beliefs.
In my view, Probably a critical witness is the former NSA director, Admiral Rogers. He was one of the intelligence chiefs who really pushed back against the Russia collusion allegations. When he left government, has kind of gone into the background. Very high reputation, very credible. That's the kind of witness, to me, that could be very, very damaging for Brennan.
Yeah, you'd certainly want somebody with that kind of, those bona fides, somebody who's kind of conducting themselves in a way that tells you they're kind of pro-law enforcement, not pro-politics.
How does the Justice Department get around a statute of limitations when the intelligence report was in 2017?
Well, starting with conspiracy. If you have a conspiracy charge, then you can use overt acts and furtherance of that conspiracy that post-date the main object. In other words, obstructionist moments later can be used to restart the statute of limitations, which is typically going to be like 5 years at the most. And it could be in this case that what they're relying on are false statements. If you've given false statements to Congress, if you've given false statements on the media, that may well be the hook they're running with. But we don't know. I mean, there could be, completely different rabbit holes that they ran down that help survive the statute of limitations beyond that.
Brennan was a paid national security analyst for NBC News. Is it possible that every time Brennan went on television that he was restarting the clock, sort of a furtherance of the conspiracy?
Essentially, yes. Not every time he's talking about anything, but if he's literally talking about the conduct back in 2016-17, if he's denying kind of tipping the scales against President Trump by getting this intelligence report out, that could work. It's going to be the subject of pretrial litigation. I mean, there's going to be motions to dismiss if you're being somewhat creative with restarting the clock on statute of limitations. But generally speaking, obstructionist behavior, conspiracy, conduct designed to keep that thing secret and successful is the type of thing that helps you avoid the statute of limitations.
Brennan, like so many of these other former senior national security officials, wrote a book. How much does the book, in his own words, come back to haunt him in a prosecution?
And that's the common thread through so many of these cases that deal with like classified information or politicized behavior. So, boy, the hubris of wanting to get a bestseller tends to trip up people a lot. It may not be something where the book has confessions, right? These are going to be pretty self-serving books, but there could be what they call false exculpatories, like things where he's clearly lying. You can prove that he's lying about something, and then you argue to a judge or jury someday that people lie for a reason, and it's because he knew he did something wrong.
Brennan has said that this is politically motivated and that it is a selective prosecution. Will he have a strong legal argument?
Yeah. Well, it depends on a couple of things. I mean, the starting point is, what does the indictment actually look like? My perspective from living with representing President Trump in 22 and 23 and seeing what was happening with Jack Smith, Alvin Bragg, Letitia James, Fani Willis, as somebody who'd been around criminal justice, when you see something that's innovative, to a fault, creative, creating crimes that nobody else has been prosecuted for, that's a red flag. That's alarming. Selectivity and vindictive prosecution are tough things to prove for the defense. Selective prosecution under the case law basically means similarly situated people weren't treated the way you were. In other words, similarly situated people were not prosecuted for this kind of conduct. And starting point is, how do you find a parallel? I mean, where do you find a CIA director who orchestrated reports for intelligence distribution and to spur impeachment and kind of the hobbling of a presidency? I don't think you're going to find a clean, selective moment by way of parallels.
We're seeing all of these indictments now. Attorney General Pam Bondi is out. There's a new acting Attorney General, Todd Blanche. Does that suggest that Bondi was holding up the process?
Not to me. Particularly white-collar cases are slow boils. When I was a supervisor in the U.S. Attorney's Office, it was always my white-collar prosecutors that said, Jim, we've got to charge this by Tuesday because the statute of limitations is going to run. And I'm like, it's been 4 years. What's going on? And so I think that these types of cases, there's a lot of dotting of I's and crossing of T's that takes a long time. And so I don't view that as something that would have ever started up overnight. It's the reactive crimes. It's the murder on the streets where you have to move quickly that are more reactive. These are not reactive crimes.
So just connecting the dots here, we have Florida. And now we have North Carolina. The former FBI Director James Comey was recently indicted, 2 counts for allegedly issuing a threat against the President of the United States when he posted the 8647 seashells on Instagram. 86 is kind of to harm somebody, and then 47 is the 47th president of the United States. The first count is for willfully making a threat against the president, and then the second is for the transmission of that threat on Instagram. Does the Comey case withstand First Amendment challenges?
Probably. What happens in threats cases is you have to have a subjective proof that establishes that there's an actual intent to threaten the target. Anything short of that is First Amendment protected. So it's kind of a redundant process to talk about it as a First Amendment case. You're either making a threat or you're not. If you're not, it's First Amendment conduct. But it's going to be difficult for any sort of pretrial motion to win the day on that issue because it's a typical kind of factual determination for a jury.
Is there a Supreme Court precedent that addresses cases like Comey?
Yeah, there is. I mean, about 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, the Supreme Court finally weighed in on something called the true threats doctrine. And the issue is just simply, do you use an objective standard? Do you just say, would a victim objectively take this as a threat to themselves? Or subjective, meaning when the person issued this threat by way of seashells or other ways, that they intended it to be received as a threat. That's a narrower, more difficult thing for the prosecution to prove. And I know Todd Blanche has made comments about we have other evidence. Mm-hmm. That's going to be important because you certainly don't have, Mr. Comey publicly confessing, yeah, I was trying to threaten him.
There's a section in the indictment called forfeiture notice, and it says that if there's a conviction, that the defendant will lose property. Are they talking about Comey's book sales? The seashells were posted as he was preparing to launch his latest crime novel.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't think it's the seashells themselves being forfeited. So you're probably looking at something where you could tie. I mean, you do have to tie in forfeiture to criminal conduct. So maybe it was promotional to make that kind of threat on Instagram and to kind of celebrate your snarkiness that way. So that's what I would guess is they're making a run at the book. It's not going to be broader than that, but that could certainly be a big bite.
The acting Attorney General Todd Blanche recently said that there's more to the indictment than just the 8647 seashells. What does that say to you?
Well, it tells me number one, he knows it's a tough case on its face. When you're talking about subjective intent to threaten versus kind of snarky, hateful comments. And there's plenty of room for moral condemnation. Don't take any of this as me supporting the actions of Comey. But I think he's probably talking about communications with third parties. Maybe they've got text threads or emails where Comey kind of betrayed the story a little bit. Well, I actually did know what 86 means, or even just animus towards President Trump around that time frame. I can't stand that guy. How could he fire me? All of that could be helpful evidence to show a subjective intent to threaten.
And the idea that he just stumbled across these seashells on the beach that spelled out 8647.
Yeah, I mean, look, I wish you could fingerprint seashells. I think I know whose would show up. But I think that was really kind of that height of hubris snark, knowing that he's not telling the truth, but thinking it's kind of cute to phrase it that way. If he betrayed that lie to other people, that would be a nice little piece of evidence to put in.
Do you anticipate there will be a superseding indictment in the Comey case? And would that charge likely be a violation of 18 U.S.C. 1001, the false statements statute?
If he made false statements to Secret Service, they could certainly weave that into a superseding indictment, adding a 1001. Not a bad fallback if there's issues with the free speech, the subjective intent on the lead counts. So it could be. I think 1001 has been so overused by prosecutors in recent years. It's kind of a substitute for actual evidence. I'd almost rather they say, we're going to go all in on these threats. And if we have lies, we'll use that. We can still make that admissible evidence, but not necessarily charge a 1001.
There's another investigation that's running in the Eastern District of Virginia. Bloomberg Law was first to report that prosecutors are looking at possible charges against Comey for the sharing of government records. And the name that's come up again is Daniel Rickman. What should people know about Daniel Rickman?
Well, that he was a longtime colleague of Comey. They were AUSAs together in Southern District of New York. And Comey brought him in for, I think, just the most reprehensible purpose. He brought this man in to be his liaison to the New York Times, gave him top secret and SCI clearance, the highest levels of clearance, so he had access to classified information. And what Comey did with this guy was have him lobby the newspaper for good treatment of Jim Comey. It wasn't even for the institution, it wasn't even for the FBI, which I still think would be very bad. But he literally had a guy designed to comfortably leak information to the New York Times that would help Jim Comey's reputation. And to me, that's one of the most devastating components of his reign as the director.
So there are these declassified records called Arctic Haze, which is 2017 investigated media leaks that related to then FBI Director James Comey. And there are two events. The first involved the leaking of classified information that related to the Clinton email investigation. The intelligence was not verified, but it suggested that then Attorney General Loretta Lynch was somehow compromised. And this is why Comey said he went around her and announced that no reasonable prosecutor would go after Hillary Clinton for the mishandling of classified information. In Arctic Haze, Daniel Rickman discusses a meeting and a conversation he had with the New York Times. And Rickman says, I don't think I confirmed to the reporter the classified information, but I'm saying this with a discount. What does with a discount mean?
Well, he's the only one that knows. I mean, I suppose he's saying there was some caveat, like, I may be shading the truth here. Usually when you come to false statement, perjury prosecutions, convenient memory loss doesn't work. And so if it's obvious that this is just kind of a convenient moment of, gee, you got to discount that, meaning don't prosecute me for lying, that will be a problem for him. But, those are still uphill cases, tough cases when they say things like that.
I mean, this looks like clever lawyer speak. Like, don't go after me for a false statement.
Yeah, it's a cry for help, for sure. He's saying, this is probably a whopper, don't prosecute me, but I'm going to say it. I mean, that's almost the parenthetical of the whole thing.
The second incident involved these Comey memos. When Jim Comey was FBI director, he documented about a half dozen conversations he had with President Trump about the Russia collusion investigation and some pretty salacious allegations that were in this dossier. Many of those memos, according to the Inspector General, they contain classified information. So could that be another area of legal exposure?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, look, and the starting point again is I like to back off from the law for a second and just talk about kind of the ethics or morality or mentality. You've got a guy going in to meet with his boss, the President of the United States, who feverishly takes self-serving notes after the meetings. Like, that's a bad sign in terms of loyalty and hubris and kind of narcissism. And then, again, if you're the FBI director, you more than anyone are supposed to know the rules of classification and storage and dissemination. And so taking these notes on your laptop out in the car after you've ticked off President Trump and then storing it in your safe at your own house, it sounds relatively secure, but it's a violation. So, he's got classified information that he's holding in a non-secure scenario, at least as I understand it.
Does the Columbia law professor have his own legal exposure?
Yes, he has it for knowingly taking possession of this type of material, passing it on to the media if he did that. I think it's really interesting. If you read the reports, it seems like Rickman is almost saying, I wasn't the one that passed it on to the New York Times. They had it. And kind of the ... is Comey did in advance of Rickman's meeting. Again, I don't have evidence of that, but it kind of reads in a way where it's like, well, who else had a motivation to do that? And that would be his buddy from, back in the old Manhattan U.S. Attorney's Office.
When you get to the bottom line, people who are supporters of the Grand Conspiracy say that former President Barack Obama was the architect of the conspiracy. He got the ball rolling. The Director of National Intelligence, President Trump, have alleged that he's guilty of treason. Does anything happen to President Obama?
What I would say as a starting point is it's not, it's kind of philosophically something you can refer to as treason or politically. It's not actual treason in terms of the statute and the elements of the crime. What is it that makes sense here as a charge? It's complicated by his position as a president, as we know about immunity. But I think that when you get down to core executive functions of a president, which is kind of where this line of qualified immunity, for lack of a better phrase, is for a president in office, conducting a shadow campaign to disable somebody you don't like politically is probably not protected. So would it go up to the Supreme Court if President Obama was indicted and there was a motion to dismiss? Yeah, absolutely. But there's room. I mean, there's room for a potential prosecution there if they chase this thing down and have the communications coming down from the president that are motivated not by some sort of interest in protecting the public or dealing with law enforcement issues, but by trying specifically to hobble President Trump.
All of this is unfolding as we approach the midterm elections, and then there are only 2 years left on the clock. Are all of these defendants or potential defendants trying to run out the clock?
They should. I mean, look, if you're a lawyer on a case like that, you're representing one of these guys, you kind of make the conclusion that time is somewhat on your side. And what I'm going to watch carefully is kind of how DOJ conducts itself when it comes to the clock, when there's indictments and when the judge is saying, when are we going to try this case? I remember watching this whole thing with Judge Chutkan and Jack Smith in D.C. Jack Smith stood there and said, we need to hurry up and try this in the next 3 or 4 months for this dubious right to a public trial, or right to a speedy trial for the public. If we see that kind of behavior, I'm going to be a little disappointed. But if they say what I think Jack Smith and company should have said, which is, Judge, you tell us we're not here for politics. We're here because we're actual prosecutors. We're going to be open file on discovery. We're going to share everything, be transparent, because it's an important matter. I'd like to see that attitude in whatever happens with these political figures. I'd like to see DOJ say, hey, we're not here for politics. We'll do it when we have to do it. And if that stretches a case beyond the midterm or a couple of years, then so be it. That would be good to see. But you're right, there's an expectation after the Trump administration, if it's not a Republican in office, that we're going to see a lot of immediate meddling with any outstanding cases.
Well, this issue, the Grand Conspiracy, whether you feel it's a legitimate allegation or not, is extremely important to President Trump's base. And it's now been a decade since some of the alleged violations occurred. Is it too late for justice?
Well, hopefully not. I mean, and that doesn't even mean necessarily that there's a whole bunch of indictments. I mean, I stick to kind of two components to this. One is if they can legitimately show ongoing conduct in support of the conspiracy, then so be it. They avoid the statute of limitations, and the base can be happy when they see some big names under legitimate indictment. That day may well come. But at the very least, we shouldn't just wed every bit of moral condemnation to convictions. I think there's incredible criticism that's fair game for Obama, for Brennan, for Lynch, for Comey, for Brennan, for people, all the way down to Peter Strzok, Lisa Page, all these different people that were politicized, that were using important law enforcement or governmental positions to get political results that they felt very self-righteous about. I would hope that over time, history looks back and says there was outrageous misconduct by these people, whether they're indicted or not.
It's hard to believe that it's been 10 years since I first started reporting on the Russia collusion abuses with the FBI, the Justice Department, and the National Security Surveillance Court. There's no question in my mind that there was gross misconduct by senior officials within the U.S. government and a complete breach of public trust when it came to this story. Also this week, I went to the White House and I took the new media seat. I was there for the first briefing by Secretary Rubio, who was filling in for Caroline Leavitt, who's on maternity leave.
Catherine, why don't we start with you first?
I'm Catherine Herridge. I'm an independent journalist. Secretary Rubio, have you seen any recent indications that Iran is willing to give up its nuclear weapons program that is credible, verifiable, and that would lead to an immediate de-escalation?
Well, look, this is a long-standing problem for them, right? I mean, they have always said they don't want a nuclear weapon. That's because they've always said that, they just don't mean it. And why do you say, well, how do you know they don't mean it? Well, we don't mean it because they're doing all the things, and historically have tried to do all the things that you do if you want a nuclear weapons program.
Getting the first question at the White House briefing is a very big deal, and I feel very grateful and humbled to have that opportunity. It also tells me that this administration has elevated independent media. The difference between me and the other reporters in the front row is that I'm not going back to a big newsroom. I don't have a big support network. We are a very small team, but as independent journalists, we're having a tremendous impact. Some weeks, we're reaching more people on social media than traditional television broadcasts. Whether you like the Trump administration or not, it seems clear to me that they have broken the legacy media stranglehold on Washington, D.C. We'll see you next time on Straight to the Point.